Aloha, and welcome to this webinar sponsored by the East-West Center in Honolulu, part of the East-West Center Research Speaker Series, which is a recurring program to spotlight emerging developments across the region. Through this series, we explore the environmental, demographic, political, and economic processes that are reshaping the Asia-Pacific region. Our speaker today is Dr. Stephanie K. Kim, who is Associate Professor of the Practice and Faculty Director of Higher Education Administration at Georgetown University. She's the author of the book, Constructing Student Mobility, How Universities Recruit Students and Shape Pathways Between Berkeley and Seoul, published by MIT Press in 2023. She's recently been in Honolulu as a POSCO Fellow, during which time she did research that helped prepare her for this webinar. Her topic is U.S.-Asia Geopolitics in American Higher Education. Our webinar will last a total of 1 hour. We'll start with a lecture from Dr. Kim, after which we'll switch to a question and answer session. Those of you in the audience are welcome to submit questions by using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We'll get to as many questions as we can. Dr. Kim.
Great. Thank you so much. Well, hello, everyone. Good morning to those of you in Hawaii, and good afternoon to those of you in the mainland. I'm very excited to give my talk today. Before I do so, I first want to just give a special thank you to the East West Center and Jenny Roy for inviting me here today. I also want to thank Carolyn Higuchi for all of her wonderful assistance when I was at the East West Center as a POSCO Fellow. And of course, I would be remiss not to thank Justina and Betty for coordinating the logistics of my talk. So at this point, I am just going to share my screen. So as Denny mentioned, my talk today is titled U.S.-Asia Geopolitics in American Higher Education. By the way, I asked ChatGPT to create an image that encapsulated this topic. So the image that you see here on the screen was actually generated by AI, and I thought I would just put that out there for kicks. My talk today is also based on a paper that I'm currently revising for Asia-Pacific issues. So I welcome your questions and feedback at the end of the talk as I return to the paper. So I want to start off my talk by discussing a specific inflection point in American higher education. At a 2018 congressional hearing, FBI Director Christopher Wray testified that the Chinese government is setting up administrative units called Confucius Institutes across American campuses and using them as tools of espionage. A couple years later, in a 2020 joint statement, Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo warned that Confucius Institutes promote an authoritarian slant in curriculum and teaching. Now, these declarations came at a time of polarizing portrayals of China across government, media, and other public discourses. Specifically, around the same time that the Confucius Institutes were getting a lot of heat, the Department of Justice launched the China Initiative from 2018 to 2022. This was an effort to prosecute perceived Chinese spies across American universities. And by the way, many scholars and activists have shown that the China Initiative amounted to nothing more than racial profiling of Chinese American scientists who were accused of being spies because of their race, which is why it was eventually shut down. But all this goes to show that this was a time when relations between the United States and China were going downhill fast. Now, recently, some partisan policymakers have gone so far as to call China a, quote, malign foreign influence. And this has profound implications for the American higher education sector. In fact, just this past December, US Senators Marco Rubio and Rick Scott introduced the Protecting Education from Malign Foreign Influence Act. And this would prohibit educational institutions from seeking relationships with foreign governments deemed adversarial to the United States, and that would include China. And while aggressive political rhetoric against China is primarily a partisan effort, there is generally bipartisan consensus that anything to do with China should be treated with suspicion, or at the very least with extreme caution. It's one of the very few things that Republicans and Democrats agree on today. So what does this all mean for American higher education? For my talk today, I'm going to unpack this notion of malign foreign influence in American higher education by focusing on the Asian Studies Center. Now, I'll talk more about them in a little more depth in just a moment, but briefly, Asian Studies Centers are administrative units housed within American universities that support academic programming on Asia. Confucius Institutes are one type of Asian Studies Centers, and as I will show, Asian Studies Centers are especially vulnerable to shifting views of China within the US government because of their historical and institutional particularities. And by the way, the picture that you see here should be familiar to those of you who are at the East-West Center or otherwise in Honolulu. But for those of you who may not be familiar, this is the building of the Center for Korean Studies at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. So the Center for Korean Studies is also another type of Asian Studies centers. And just to share a little bit of background about this project, I spent some time at UH last year while I was at the East-West Center as a visiting fellow, conducting research on malign foreign influence in American higher education. And as you can see in the photo, this building, it's a beautiful building located on a beautiful campus with strong ties to Asia. There's this Korean Hanok where the Center for Korean Studies is housed. There's a Thai pavilion that was a gift to the university from the King and Queen of Thailand. There's also a Japanese garden nearby. And this all feels very normal, unremarkable even for a university that prides itself at lying at the geographical nexus between the United States and Asia. So it was sometimes a little jarring for me to do this research on malign foreign influence when I'm essentially immersed in what is everyday foreign influence on campus. But going back to Asian Studies Centers, I said earlier that they are administrative units housed within American universities. So within a university, scholarly labor is divided between the activities that happen between departments and not departments. Departments are perhaps what most people are familiar with when they think of a university. They are academic units where teaching and learning happen. Departments are where professors are hired. Departments are where students take courses. And most importantly, departments are funded by internal money that's distributed by the university's central leadership. On the other hand, not departments is a recently coined term by higher education scholars to encompass centers, institutes, initiatives, and so forth. Basically everything that is not a department, as the name implies. Not departments are administrative units that manage and distribute money. And most often, that money comes from external sources, and different not departments have different missions and functions, which are guided by their funding. One type of not department that I'd like to focus on today is the Area Studies Center. Area Studies Centers are not departments that support academic programming in world regions with mostly external funding. They were originally established across American universities with Department of Defense funding during the Cold War decades, and their goal is to cultivate future experts on world regions who can advise the US government. Now, area studies centers with a regional focus on Asia are called, as you would expect, Asian Studies Centers. Asian Studies Centers were first established alongside other regional area studies centers, such as Latin American, African, and Middle East Studies centers, with Department of Defense funding. But more recently, Asian Studies centers have also come to rely on money from overseas in order to operate, specifically money from the governments of Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, and most recently, China. So they often operate with a combination of federal and foreign funding. And compared to the other area studies centers, it's more common for Asian studies centers to operate with foreign funding. They have had quite a long history of accepting money from foreign governments for decades. But as US policymakers have recently cast suspicion on China and foreign funding in American higher education more generally, Asian studies centers now have to negotiate domestic security concerns with foreign government interests, which is why I focus on the Asian Studies Center specifically as the epicenter of US-Asia geopolitics in American higher education. To provide a brief history of area studies centers, they were first established in 1958 in the middle of the Cold War when President Eisenhower signed the National Defense Education Act, or NDEA for short. The purpose of the NDEA was to expand access to education for American youth so that they could better compete with their Soviet counterparts, especially after the Soviet Union launched Sputnik and triggered the space race. A lot of the NDEA's focus was on encouraging Americans to pursue higher education in the STEM fields, but it also sought to build a democratic world order through America's engagement with other countries. The idea was, as a global leader, the United States needed its citizens to be able to communicate with other citizens from around the world. However, at that time, very few American campuses offered foreign languages beyond those focused on Western Europe. So the NDEA included a program called Title VI that provided federal funds to universities to offer foreign language and area studies programs for uncommonly taught languages. So with Title VI funding, American campuses now offered programs in African studies, Asian Pacific studies, Latin American studies, Middle East studies, and of course, Russian and Eurasian studies. And these new programs were launched in newly established area studies centers. So going back to my earlier slide, I want to show you how this was all organized into a university, just through a visual demonstration. So before Title VI funding, universities offered foreign language courses only within language and literature departments. So for example, if someone wanted to study Chinese, they would have to study in the Asian language and literature department. But Title VI funding intentionally created area studies programs not in a department, but in an area studies center. And this meant that area studies centers could draw courses from all sorts of departments like history, political science, linguistics, economics, sociology, geography, anthropology, and so forth. The idea was to cultivate students with broad expertise on a world region. And this is the strength of area studies centers today, that they are interdisciplinary, unlike departments that have to adhere to a specific discipline. And this essentially is the birth of area studies in American higher education. In the first year of the NDEA's operations, 19 area studies centers were established across top research universities, which you can see here at UC Berkeley, University of Chicago, Columbia, Harvard, Howard, University of Kansas, University of Michigan, NYU, UPenn, Princeton, Stanford, University of Washington, University of Wisconsin, and Yale. Now, in addition to emphasizing the teaching and learning of Russian, this was the Cold War, the NDEA also emphasized the importance of Asian studies centers, especially since there were a number of US military confrontations across Asia. And you see this reflected in NDEA operations. So, for example, the NDEA designated the Asian languages like Chinese, Japanese, and Hindi Urdu as the highest priority languages. And also, as you can see in the table here, 9 of the 19 centers established in the first year of the NDEA were dedicated to providing instruction in Asian languages. And as of today, the Title VI program has awarded the greatest number of grants to universities that offer programs on Asia compared to any other world region. Now, alongside area studies centers, the US government also established complementary programs in international education. This includes the Fulbright program and the Peace Corps that sent Americans overseas and brought foreign students and scholars to American campuses. Additionally, private foundations such as the Ford Foundation, MacArthur Foundation, Mellon Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, and Social Science Research Council also supported area studies programs. Alongside Title VI, these funding agencies made it possible for area studies and international education more broadly to flourish over the next several decades, albeit with a Cold War agenda. Throughout the 70s and 80s, political and financial support for area studies ebbed and flowed, especially as US-Soviet confrontations evolved. When the Cold War eventually ended in the 90s, an era of fiscal conservatism came to dominate federal policy. And this is when political and financial support for area studies dramatically waned. Private foundations also questioned their commitment to area studies as their attention shifted to other issues like globalization. And lastly, academics even questioned their commitment to area studies, especially after Francis Fukuyama declared the end of history with the seeming ascendancy of Western democracy. And instead, academics turned their attention to more timely and critical frameworks like global studies, diaspora studies, ethnic studies, post-colonial studies, and indigenous studies. So diminished funding for and diminished intellectual engagement with area studies beginning in the 90s opened up a vacuum that was filled by an alternative funding model. Now, because area studies centers relied heavily on external funding, such as grants from the federal government and from private foundations, they looked for money elsewhere. For Asian Studies centers specifically, new funding sources came from overseas as foreign governments sought to expand their cultural significance in the United States. One of the earliest foreign funding sources for Asian Studies centers was the Japanese government. The Japanese government began investing in international education programs through the Japan Foundation, which was established in 1972. The foundation's mission is to deepen understanding of Japan around the world. With government funding, the Japan Foundation began donating to overseas universities to establish and expand Japanese studies programs. Funding for these programs totaled well over $1 billion throughout the 90s, and a significant portion of that went to universities in the United States. And also during this time, it wasn't just the Japan Foundation, but Japanese corporations were also giving money to American campuses in order to improve Japan's image after an era of Japan bashing in the 80s. Another funding source was the Taiwanese government. The Taiwanese government established the Chiang Ching-kuo Foundation in 1989 with help from private organizations. The foundation's mission is to support and encourage research in Chinese studies. And like the Japan Foundation, the Chiang Ching-kuo Foundation began donating to overseas universities to establish and expand Chinese studies programs. Throughout the 90s, the foundation distributed over $50 million to universities in the United States, and this made a significant impact on the availability of Chinese language and subject matter courses across American campuses. Yet another foreign funding source was the South Korean government. In 1991, the South Korean government established the Korea Foundation, whose mission is to promote awareness and understanding of Korea. With government funding, the Korea Foundation began donating to overseas universities to establish and expand Korean studies programs. And its expenditures were quite modest when they began in the 90s, but they eventually rivaled and even surpassed their Japanese and Taiwanese counterparts by the 2000s. And the Korea Foundation has been especially successful in establishing Korean studies professorships in the United States. For many Asian studies centers, these new funding sources from overseas became just as important as Title VI funding in maintaining and growing area studies programs. They widened course offerings for students, funded student and scholar research projects, expanded library collections, trained future language teachers, and encouraged universities to hire professors with expertise on a specific country. And from the perspective of the Japanese, Taiwanese, and South Korean governments, newly funded academic activities established a stronger foothold for Japanese, Chinese, and Korean language and culture to flourish within the American academy, especially when they may otherwise have been neglected or overlooked. To give you a sense of how significant this funding is even today, this is a table of funding that supported East Asian studies programs recently. So in fiscal year 2023, Title VI provided $10 million to universities offering programs on East Asia. Meanwhile, in fiscal years 2022 and in fiscal year 2022, the Changqing Kuo Foundation provided $4.7 million. The Japan Foundation provided $11.6 million, and the Korea Foundation provided $12.7 million. And as you can see, foreign funding certainly rivals that provided by the federal government for Asian studies programs, even today. Now, with more money coming from overseas, Asian studies centers reorganize their activities with new priorities. Previously, Title VI funding encouraged regional specialization across Asia as Cold War geopolitics grouped different countries together under a military framework of Asia Pacific. And it was also just a simplified way of integrating an entire world region into a college curriculum. But as the governments of Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea became more influential benefactors of Asian studies, they encouraged activities with country-specific foci as they emphasized their own country's uniqueness. So organizationally, this led to the establishment of country-specific centers that became more common across Asian studies compared to other area studies fields. So across many universities, you often see Asian studies centers broken down by country and organized in a way that looks something like this. And this arrangement reflects how these centers are most likely managing federal funding with foreign funding. Now, foreign funding for Asian studies centers largely went uncontested until Confucius Institutes arrived on American campuses in 2004. Confucius Institutes are funded by the Chinese government through Hanban. Confucius Institutes are a type of Asian studies center that administer Chinese language and culture courses across primary and secondary schools. In total, there are or were 121 Confucius Institutes in operation in the United States, and the US is actually where the most Confucius Institutes had opened. For the sake of comparison, Title VI grants for East Asia were awarded to 133 institutions since 2000. So the number of Confucius Institutes, 121, certainly rivaled the number of Title VI centers, which fueled widespread criticism and alarm. And as I noted at the beginning of my talk, US policymakers openly criticized Confucius Institutes as relations between the United States and China soured. Antagonism toward Confucius Institutes came to a head in 2019 with the passing of the National Defense Authorization Act, also known as the McCain Act. The McCain Act prohibits higher education institutions that receive Department of Defense funding from hosting a Confucius Institute by citing national security concerns. And this effectively barred campuses with a Title VI supported center from hosting a Confucius Institute. And because of this, almost all Confucius Institutes, all but a few, that had been operating in the United States closed abruptly after 2019. But suspicion toward China did not end with Confucius Institutes. Beginning in 2019, the Department of Education began more strictly enforcing Section 117 of the Higher Education Act. The section requires that higher education institutions report any foreign gifts that total over 250,000. But new demands from the Department of Education now require that institutions provide information that far exceeds the minimum reporting requirements. And the Department of Education has also threatened civil or criminal action against institutions that do not comply with its demands. So, rising tensions around foreign influence in American higher education have made Asian studies centers, especially those with strong ties to China, skittish. While money from the governments of Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea are generally considered uncontroversial in the United States, the proximity of Asian studies centers to the recently closed Confucius Institutes and more scrutiny over foreign funding generally create a chilling climate for foreign partnerships. Just to give you a very recent example, I read in the journalist Karen Fisher's newsletter that's published in the Chronicle of Higher Education that US House lawmakers just approved a bill this month that would restrict American universities that have relationships with, quote, Chinese entities of concern from receiving funds from the Department of Homeland Security. So the Department of Homeland Security typically gives money to universities when there's an unexpected disaster like fires and floods. But this bill is so broadly written that it defines entities of concern as any program that has any relationship with the Chinese government, which pretty much would include almost all Chinese universities since they're all, for the most part, public institutions. Skipping ahead. So the point I wanted to make with all of this is that US policymakers continue to use anti-China rhetoric and question the appropriateness of foreign funding on campus, on American campuses. And as they do, Asian studies centers are unduly affected. So what does this all mean from a policy perspective? Well, the use of education to advance geopolitical interests represents a government's ideologies about the future, because education is ultimately about shaping the next generation. From the perspective of the foreign governments, funding Asian studies programs allows a future generation of Americans to have positive exposure to their language and culture. But for US policymakers who seek to thwart foreign funding in American higher education, their efforts are predicated on the belief that American students are somehow corrupted with foreign influence if their education is funded by a foreign government. And this belief assumes that students are passive entities at the complete mercy of their financial backers. But we could turn to generations of students who have undergone area studies training since 1958, essentially for the past 66 years, to see that that idea is patently absurd. So, for example, students who received scholarships through Title VI and other Cold War era programming are now established scholars. And if you read their accounts where they reflect on this, you can see that they didn't become these uncritical imperialist scholars with a Cold War agenda. Instead, they reflected on their own national identity as Americans and America's role in the world. Likewise, students who received scholarships through foreign funding agencies are also now established scholars. And if you read their accounts where they reflect on this, they didn't become uncritical champions of foreign countries, but instead reflected on their positionality as outsiders to countries interested in advancing their uniqueness in the United States. So, whether a student's training in Asian studies was funded by the federal or a foreign government, ultimately, their highly specialized skill set serves American interests abroad by offering a full spectrum of expertise on Asia and advancing people-to-people ties between the United States and its global partners. And on a more personal note, I myself benefited from both federal and foreign funding to support my training in Asian studies. When I was in graduate school, I received Title VI money for many years to learn Korean. I was also supported by the Fulbright program to conduct my dissertation research in South Korea. Then, after finishing graduate school, I held a Korea Foundation postdoctoral fellowship, and then I worked for a number of years as the program director of an Asian Studies Center. So, in other words, my very professional trajectory is the embodiment of US-Asia geopolitics in higher education. And I will tell you firsthand, as now a mid-career academic, you can barely get academics to listen to their own dean, let alone get academics to listen to the demands of a foreign government, even if they accept foreign money. And that's the beauty of academic freedom. In other words, Asian studies centers might accept foreign funding to support their activities, but it doesn't have much bearing on the ideologies of the people who benefit from that money. But what it does affect is whether or not academic programming in Asian studies is even offered at all. I'm going to return to my earlier example of the University of Hawaii. So the now defunct Confucius Institute at UH had been receiving up to $335,000 a year to administer Chinese language courses at local K through 12 schools and to provide scholarships to university students who are learning Chinese. After the university abruptly closed its Confucius Institute in 2019, K through 12 students could no longer learn Chinese, and university students lost their scholarships. And that money was never replaced with federal or other domestic funding. And today, Chinese studies remains drastically underfunded compared to other Asian studies programs at the University of Hawaii. And this is a notable shift for a university with strong ties to the Chinese diaspora and that lies at the geographical nexus between the US and Asia. So the shutting down of Confucius Institutes at UH and elsewhere weakened the robustness of Chinese studies programs. And if something like this could happen at a place like UH, then it's much worse for a university that has even less resources and connections to Asia than UH does. And lastly, for those who are justifiably skeptical of China, the CCP, and generally its anti-democratic behavior, I want to invoke the example of vice presidential candidate Tim Walz. As probably you already know, Tim Walz was running educational exchange programs in China for American high school students for many decades. And this was influenced by his very early experience teaching English in China when he had finished college. Now, at the same time, Tim Walz is a fierce critic of the CCP. As a congressman, he hosted the Dalai Lama and Hong Kong democracy activist Joshua Wong, which shows how he understands that there is a difference between fostering people-to-people connections while also criticizing the government as a separate entity from its people. And an essential part of fostering people-to-people connections is to educate the next generation of leaders with foreign language and area studies training. So for Asian Studies centers, accepting foreign funding alleviates the burden of funding Asian studies programs on American taxpayers and allows them to offer robust programs that likely would not exist without that support. And this is key for the United States if it wants to remain a global leader, especially at a time when relations between the United States, China, and other countries are fraying. To assert American leadership overseas means also to understand and empathize with people overseas. And that requires foreign language and area studies training. President Eisenhower understood this when he signed the NDEA into law in 1958. And while university finances have evolved since that time, the need for future leaders trained in Asian studies remains just as important, if not more important today, given today's geopolitical tensions. So thank you very much. And I am happy to chat and answer any questions.
Sorry, thank you, Dr. Kim. We transitioned to question and answer session now. As a reminder, you can type your question into the Q&A chat box, and we'll get to as many as we can. First question, Dr. Kim. You articulate very well the disadvantages of what you might call an overly suspicious attitude toward foreign funding of Asian studies centers in the United States. I think you would also acknowledge that there are some legitimate concerns with entities such as, for example, the Confucius Institutes. So what advice would you give U.S. government officials making policy in this area of regulating foreign funding of U.S. Educational institutions to avoid the disadvantages of going too hard in either direction on an issue like this that requires some subtlety?
Yeah, you make a great point. And right now, I think that policy making tends to be a binary. It's all or nothing, to allow the floodgates of foreign funding in or completely banish it or make it so restrictive that no university would want to go in this direction. There's definitely a middle ground, especially for policymakers that are concerned about national security, especially if there is any kind of sensitive scientific research and whatnot. So there are safeguards that can be put in place. So when a university accepts foreign funding, depending on where the funding is going, what kind of funding that is and what other programs are being affected, there are certain safeguards that can be developed where both can happen at the same time. For example, there are a number of groups that have advocated for the US to re-allow the hosting of Confucius Institutes for universities that also have Title VI supported centers. And that would also be with certain safeguards put in place. So far, not many universities have, or so far that this hasn't been implemented, but that is just one example of something that doesn't have to be so draconian, but that could still appease concerns around national security.
Would you categorize the Asian Studies program at the University of Hawaii as a not department or a non-department? I think non-department is a better term.
The non-department. So yeah, wow. So every university is set up slightly differently, and every center, I worked at an Asian Studies center at a completely different university, and it looked a little bit different. I think for UH specifically, the Asian Studies program is housed as a joint effort within the School of Pacific and Asian Studies, if I'm not mistaken, which it's not housed in the centers, but so it operates as a separate entity, but nonetheless, the centers support the degree program. And so, a lot of these, a lot of the leadership of the centers often comes from the School of Pacific and Asian Studies. So I guess that's hard to say. The program is not housed in a not department per se, because it's not housed in the Asian Studies centers. But nonetheless, it is very much influenced by the robustness of the centers that often support a lot of the programming, as well as not just the direct academic programming, but also the external programming as well, public events, etc.
Short answer is complicated.
It's complicated. Yeah, and that's probably the story of all uh, organizational structures of universities. I used a very simplified model in my talk, but like I said, every university does things slightly differently, and it's going to have slightly different nuances that will affect it in other ways.
Next question. If we reverse our point of view and we looked at how foreign schools outside the United States operate their English or American studies programs, are they similarly separated as centers within their higher education institutions in, for example, Japan, Taiwan, Korea, or China?
Yeah, so I think that's a bigger question on how are universities outside of the United States structured, and are they structured similarly in the way US universities are structured in terms of departments and not departments? Depends on the country's higher education sector. So, for example, in South Korea, where I've done a lot of comparative research, uh, for the most part, yes, there are separations between departments and not departments. Departments typically have the most say in academic governance, and if you are part of a department, you have much more influence than if you were, say, part of a not department. And so in some ways it's similar, but funding for these things is very different overseas than in the United States. For the United States, relative to higher education sectors in other countries, not departments tend to be much more externally focused in their funding sources. Not to say other higher education sectors in other countries don't do this, but money coming in from external sources is more of an American feature than in other places.
Next question. As geopolitical tensions continue to rise, particularly with nations like China, how will the next presidential administration balance national security concerns with maintaining academic freedom and fostering global collaboration in American universities? Particularly, what about a Harris administration? What specific policies would she, as president of Asian descent, implement to ensure that foreign funding for area studies programs, such as those in Asian studies centers, would remain transparent and support educational excellence without compromising U.S. interests?
That's a great question. And I really hope that the next administration, whoever that might be, really closely takes a look at the importance of Asian studies programs, of course, but international education programs more broadly. In the previous administration from 2016 to 2020, there were a lot of programs that were abruptly shut down, zeroed out in funding. It was a really controversial time. Just to give you an example, the Fulbright program that had been operating in China for many decades was abruptly shut down in the last administration, and it still hasn't reopened. So, part of the next administration's duties, I hope, is to revisit a lot of what had been lost or canceled, and to rethink what it means to have American leadership and engagement overseas with the revitalization of these programs, and to re-examine policies that have had a dire effect on Asian studies and international education more broadly.
If you think the U.S. government's fears of Chinese control or leverage over programs that the Chinese government might sponsor in the United States, and you were testifying before, let's say, a congressional committee that might have some influence on U.S. policy in this area, what would you tell that committee?
I would tell the committee some of the points I raised earlier in my talk and some of my earlier comments that, that if there are national security concerns, they can be mitigated with certain safeguards in place that would still allow a university to accept foreign funding or have a foreign partnership without having to completely get rid of it or avoid it at all costs, and still maintain whatever security measures are necessary. I mean, we've already seen with things like the China Initiative in the STEM fields with much harsher restrictions around foreign partnerships in the STEM fields, a sudden decrease in collaborations between scientists in the United States and China. And that's only to the detriment of the US and the scientific community here. So, so there is a way to develop nuanced safeguards without having to completely omit foreign funding at whatever cost.
Next question. Have institutions sponsored by Asian governments disproportionately directed an unusually large proportion of their, say, their outreach funding to American universities in particular, as opposed to universities in other countries? And if so, was this a reflection of the international influence of the United States or the quality of US institutions or something else?
Yeah, the short answer to that is generally yes. So if you look at the history of funding coming from, the Japan Foundation, Chung Ching-kuo Foundation, and Korea Foundation, yes, most of their funding generally has focused on developing Asian studies programs in US universities as opposed to universities in other parts of the world. I think that's reflective of the influence of American higher education, its pull and its clout that continues to attract foreign funding even today. And you see that also reflected in the Confucius Institutes. So there were the most number of Confucius Institutes that had opened in the United States. Of course, now that isn't the case, but when they were opening throughout the 2000s and 2010s, they were opening most heavily in the United States.
Next question. There have been a lot of news reports in the United States about Chinese government-sponsored entities conducting spying operations in the United States, including spying on Chinese students who are attending university courses in the United States, sometimes by other Chinese nationals. Is there evidence that the Confucian Institutes have been involved in this sort of activity? Do you have any thoughts on this? Also, have the Confucian Institutes in Europe been implicated in similar kinds of allegations? Let me just throw in here that there were problems with the Confucian Institutes that led to their being closed in the United States that went beyond them being involved possibly in spying activities, such as their presentation of some of the content involved in their courses and non-transparency in their use of funds. Go ahead.
Yeah, with the Confucius Institute specifically, the biggest issues were around how they were administered. So most often there would be an administrator based at the US university where it was housed and a co-administrative director that was sent by the Chinese government, and the two would work jointly to administer the Confucius Institute. Similarly, many of the teachers were not necessarily locally hired, but often sent from overseas from the Chinese government and deployed at the various local K through 12 schools where the classes were being conducted. And this is where a lot of the tension arose. I'm not going to comment on the spying part. I don't know if there's necessarily solid evidence for the spying piece of it, but certainly there were issues raised around, the curriculum, which was designed from the Chinese partner, not necessarily locally, and whatnot. But all this to say that was this a perfect system in which curricular control was left to the US run program? No, not necessarily. And I think that's where Confucius Institutes perhaps differed than some of the other programming that's been funded by other foreign governments. But again, like I said, this might be even one avenue where more nuanced policies can be written, where you can still have foreign support for these types of programs, and make stipulations around who gets curricular control, who has teachers, who hires teachers, who has administrative control, et cetera.
Next question. We talked about previously a bit about the possibility of a Harris administration taking sort of a new look at this question and maybe adapting U.S. policy. Do we know if any administrators at U.S. universities are preparing concrete proposals against the possibility of Tim Walsh being the future vice president, expecting that there might be a more sympathetic view toward moving the needle closer to what you would advocate?
I think there's certainly excitement in the international education community about that very real possibility. A Harris-Walz administration would be historic on many levels, and one of those ways is, of course, the VP candidate has a very strong background in international education, and even Kamala Harris's parents met as international students at UC Berkeley. And so both of them have these strong ties to the possibilities of international education. And so that is certainly an optimistic, bright spot for the community.
Next question. Given that China is hacking us and trying to influence voters, aren't they smart enough to hide their influence in classes that they would give in the US so that some students would not necessarily recognize it? So the question is, are we smart enough in implementing the kind of safeguards that you would recommend?
Yeah. I'm going to approach this as more of a pedagogical question. So there might be students who come into a classroom with certain views, especially if they come, because they were educated in a certain way or from a certain system, and it might come out in the classroom, it might come out in the way they engage their peers. Speaking as a longtime educator myself, you run into all sorts of students who come in with all sorts of preconceived notions. And certainly part of the American educational experience is to expand people's preset notions and challenge them in critical ways so that people develop critical thinking skills. So, I'm not sure if that necessarily answered the question about the spying or the hacking, but certainly, I think that those who experience American higher education know that a critical piece of that is developing critical thinking skills.
Next question. How aware are you of how U.S. Counterparts to the Asian government-sponsored Asian Studies centers in the United States are treated in other countries? For example, in China, is there a similar or worse kind of suspicion leveled against branches or campuses of U.S. universities operating in China?
Yeah, so for example, with the example you gave of US-led educational institutions operating in China, I'm thinking of, for example, international branch campuses that operate in China. There are certainly restrictions on how they can operate in the country. Typically for international branch campuses, they must be, the details are a little bit complicated, but essentially they still must be operated with domestic partners. And so it's not exactly like, it doesn't look like in other countries where an American institution is simply just setting up shop. There's a lot more legal complication. In this current climate where geopolitical tensions are raised between the US and China, there have also been a lot of restrictions on American institutions operating in China, and their future viability. So, yeah, I mean, this is a really an important and sensitive issue. I think that currently the policies that are happening on both sides, on both the US side and China side, are not conducive to to allaying some of these tensions, especially as they pertain to educational opportunities. And that's a real shame because, as I've said in my talk, education is about fostering people-to-people connections and really cultivating an empathetic stance in future leaders.
This question is not precisely on the topic you talked about today, but maybe you have some thoughts. This has to do with the Confucius Center operating in Kabul, Afghanistan. Since the Taliban takeover, according to this questioner, while the Taliban has discontinued almost all other centers, the Confucius Center continues to operate. And the question is, what benefits would the Taliban see to continuing to allow this center to operate when others have been closed?
That's interesting. I was not aware of that, and I haven't been too aware of the Confucius Institute operating in Afghanistan. So that's an interesting piece of information. To tell you the, the truth, I won't be able to fully answer that, but just speaking more hypothetically, these are centers that are almost entirely, if not entirely, supported by overseas funding, and I'm sure that the government has seen a benefit to offering these Chinese language and culture courses without necessarily having to pay for it themselves.
Next question. In what ways are the Japan Foundation and the Korea Foundation part of their respective countries' soft power as opposed to being autonomous or independent? In other words, are these really government organizations or are they NGOs that help carry out public diplomacy? It seems blurry.
It is blurry. So technically, they are separate organizations from the government, but they often operate under either the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I think for the Japan Foundation specifically, it started out under the Ministry of Education. Now it's part of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which goes to show that it is definitely part of their foreign outreach and soft power efforts. So, they're not necessarily directly under executive leadership, but they do operate with government funding. Any fluctuations in the government budget will affect the budgets of the Japan Foundation and Korea Foundation. So they're very much closely tied. Of course, there are other organizations as well that do similar work. For example, the Academy of Korean Studies is another funding arm of the South Korean government, even if it's not directly a government agency.
Next question. Would you advocate for university administrators who would value reduction of the restrictions on foreign-funded centers on their campuses, being proactive in approaching the next presidential administration rather than waiting for these administrations to come around to addressing their concerns on their own?
Yes, absolutely. This is an effort that affects many higher education institutions. It affects many students as well who could potentially be benefiting from the support for Asian studies that has now been restricted or otherwise blocked. And I think that for the next administration, that would be a really wonderful thing if there were a communal effort to address some of these issues in a proactive way.
All right, we've reached the end of the questions in the queue and our time is about up. So let me say thank you, Dr. Kim, for this very interesting presentation. And thanks to all of you who attended and especially those who submitted questions. The YouTube recording of this event will be posted on the East West Center's YouTube channel and also on the East West Center's website event page. We'll be having more similar webinars under the same series, so please check the East West Center website for more information about upcoming webinars. Until then, ahuyo, and thanks for attending.